Thinking no fear? Try spending a night alone in an Ozark morgue. Not only do the unexplained occurrences stack up, but there's a set of bizarre, unspoken rules you must follow to survive the shift. We're about to pull back the curtain on the chilling reality of what happens when the veil between worlds thins. And trust me, you'll never look at a morgue the same way again. The Clearwater County morgue sits like a forgotten tombstone against the Missouri landscape, its brick facade weathered by decades of Ozark winters. Built in 1952 on land that locals whisper was once a Civil War burial ground, the single-story building houses secrets that would make even the bravest soul reconsider their career choices. When the sun disappears behind the rolling hills and the last day shift worker locks the front door, something fundamentally changes within those sterile walls. Elena Rodriguez had been working the night shift for 3 months when she first heard about the rules. Nobody had bothered to mention them during her orientation, and the employee handbook certainly didn't contain any warnings about supernatural protocol. It was her supervisor, Thomas Blackwood, who finally sat her down after her 4th consecutive night of reporting equipment malfunctions and unusual temperature fluctuations. The conversation took place in the break room, fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry wasps. Thomas, a man whose weathered face spoke of 20 years in morgue business, leaned back in his plastic chair and studied Elena with tired eyes that had seen too much. "You're not crazy," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had long ago stopped questioning the impossible. "And you're not imagining things. But if you want to keep working here, if you want to make it through the night without losing your mind, you need to understand that this place operates by different rules after dark." Elena remembered how her coffee cup trembled in her hands as Thomas began to explain. The Clearwater County morgue wasn't just a place where the dead waited for their final journey. It was a threshold, a thin space where the boundary between worlds grew gossamer weak when darkness fell. The building's history stretched back further than its official construction date, built upon land that had absorbed too much death, too much grief, too much unfinished business. The first strange incident had occurred during Elena's 2nd week. She was alone in the prep room, completing paperwork for a recent arrival, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed off the linoleum floor with an almost rhythmic precision. She called out, thinking perhaps the sheriff had stopped by or another staff member had returned for something forgotten. Silence answered her, but the footsteps continued their measured pace, growing closer to the prep room door. Elena approached the doorway cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, bathed in the sickly green glow of emergency lighting. Yet the footsteps persisted, now directly in front of her, as if someone invisible stood mere inches away. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the mechanical hum of the ventilation system and Elena's ragged breathing. That night, she discovered the first rule written on a yellowed piece of paper tucked behind the coffee maker. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if scrawled by someone in a hurry or in fear. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the footsteps in the hallway after midnight. They belong to someone who isn't finished walking. But that was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, Elena encountered more phenomena that defied rational explanation. The temperature in storage room C would plummet without warning, forcing her to wear winter coats indoors even during Missouri's humid summers. Gurney wheels would spin on their own, creating an eerie metallic singing that echoed through the empty corridors. Most unsettling of all was the way certain bodies seemed to shift position slightly between her rounds, as if settling into more comfortable poses for their eternal rest. The second rule appeared taped inside her locker after a particularly disturbing night when she had witnessed every light in the building flicker in perfect synchronization, like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the electrical system. Rule 2. If all the lights flicker 3 times in succession, immediately go to the chapel and wait there until sunrise. Do not investigate. Do not question what caused it. Elena learned that the chapel, a small room barely larger than a closet that contained a simple wooden cross and 2 folding chairs, served as some kind of sanctuary. Former employees had discovered that whatever forces moved through the morgue seemed unable or unwilling to enter that sacred space. Thomas explained that previous night shift workers had tested this theory during their most terrifying encounters, and the chapel had never failed to provide refuge. The building itself seemed to breathe at night, its walls expanding and contracting with subtle creaks that followed no logical pattern. Elena began to recognize the different sounds, the settling groans that meant nothing, the sharp cracks that preceded electrical anomalies, and the soft whispers that emanated from the walls themselves when the veil grew thinnest. These whispers were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of working at Clearwater County Morgue. They weren't quite voices and weren't quite wind, but something in between that seemed to carry fragments of conversations from another time or place. Elena caught occasional words, names she didn't recognize, pleas for help, angry accusations that made no sense in context. The whispers were strongest near storage room C and weakest in the chapel, as if the building's spiritual geography had clearly defined territories. Dr. Miranda Hayes, the county coroner, had tried to explain away the phenomena during Elena's first month. She spoke of old buildings settling, of underground water affecting the foundation, of psychological stress manifesting as perceived supernatural activity. But Elena noticed how Dr. Hayes never worked past sunset, how she hurried through her duties when darkness began to approach, and how her hands shook slightly when signing off on bodies destined for overnight storage. The truth was that everyone who worked at the morgue knew something was wrong with the place, but acknowledging it openly meant confronting a reality that challenged everything they thought they understood about life and death. It was easier to rationalize, to explain away, to pretend that the night shift workers were simply overworked or overstressed. But Thomas had worked there long enough to abandon such comfortable delusions. He had seen too many good employees quit after a single night shift, too many tough individuals reduced to trembling wrecks by encounters that defied scientific explanation. He had learned to accept the rules not because he understood them, but because following them was the only way to maintain even a tenuous grip on sanity in a place where sanity was constantly under assault. As Elena's first month progressed, she began to understand why the morgue had such difficulty keeping night shift staff. The position paid well above average for the area, offered excellent benefits, and required minimal qualifications. On paper, it should have been a sought-after job. In reality, most people lasted less than a week before finding reasons to quit or simply never returning after particularly disturbing shifts. The isolation made everything worse. The morgue sat 3 miles outside of town, surrounded by dense Ozark forest that seemed to press against the building like curious fingers. Cell phone reception was spotty at best, and the landline had a tendency to produce strange sounds during the witching hours, sometimes static that almost sounded like voices, sometimes clear tones that formed no recognizable pattern. Elena had begun keeping a journal of incidents, initially thinking she might present evidence to Dr. Hayes or perhaps contact a paranormal research group. But as the entries accumulated, she realized that documenting the phenomena only made them feel more real, more immediate. Reading her own accounts of shadow figures, unexplained sounds, and equipment malfunctions written in her careful handwriting somehow made the experiences more tangible and therefore more terrifying. The third rule manifested itself after Elena had been working at the morgue for 6 weeks. She had grown somewhat accustomed to the building's nightly symphony of strange sounds and had developed coping mechanisms for dealing with the more disturbing phenomena. But nothing had prepared her for the night when she heard someone singing. The voice was beautiful, hauntingly melodic, and completely impossible. Elena was alone in the building, had been for over 3 hours, and had checked every room twice during her security rounds. Yet the singing continued, a wordless lullaby that seemed to emanate from storage room C. The melody was familiar yet unplaceable, like a half-remembered song from childhood that lingered just beyond the edge of conscious memory. Against every instinct screaming at her to avoid investigation, Elena found herself drawn toward the sound. The singing grew stronger as she approached storage room C, and she could feel the temperature dropping with each step. By the time she reached the door, her breath was visible in small puffs, and her fingers were beginning to lose feeling despite the building's climate control. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. The singing was definitely coming from inside the storage room, but there was something wrong with the acoustics. It sounded distant and close simultaneously, as if the voice was singing from somewhere very far away, but the sound was being channeled directly into the room. Elena's hand was reaching for the door handle when she noticed the third rule, hastily scrawled in red ink on the wall beside the entrance. Rule 3. Never open storage room C when you hear singing. The voice belongs to someone who should not be singing. The fourth rule revealed itself during Elena's 8th week at the Clearwater County Morgue, on a night when autumn had begun to creep into the Missouri hills. The leaves were turning, and with them came a change in the building's atmosphere that Elena couldn't quite define. It was as if the approaching season had awakened something that had been dormant during the summer months, something that stirred restlessly in the shadows between the fluorescent lights. Elena had developed a routine by then, a careful choreography of movement and timing that helped her navigate the night shift with minimal disturbance from whatever entities called the morgue home. She knew which hallways to avoid after 2 a.m., which rooms required her to hum softly to keep the whispers at bay, and which corners seemed to collect shadows that moved independently of any light source. But routine, she learned, was exactly what they had been waiting for. It started with the gurneys. Elena had been restocking supplies in the prep room when she heard the familiar squeak of wheels rolling across linoleum. She paused, listening carefully. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, as if someone was methodically moving equipment through the hallways. But Elena knew she was alone in the building, had been for 4 hours, and all the gurneys had been properly secured in their designated positions. She stepped into the hallway and froze. 3 gurneys were moving in a slow procession down the corridor, their wheels turning with mechanical precision. They moved single file, maintaining perfect spacing, heading toward storage room C with the deliberate pace of a funeral march. The gurneys were empty, their white sheets draped neatly over invisible forms, but they moved as if guided by unseen hands with a specific destination in mind. Elena pressed herself against the wall, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. But Thomas had warned her about sudden movements during supernatural encounters. They respond to fear, he had said. Not the normal kind of fear everyone feels working here, but panic. Lose control, and you lose everything. So Elena stood perfectly still and watched the impossible procession pass her by. The gurneys moved with eerie silence except for the soft whisper of their wheels. And as they passed, she felt the temperature drop noticeably. The third gurney paused directly in front of her, its wheels stopping so abruptly that the sudden silence felt like a physical blow. For 30 seconds that stretched like hours, Elena stared at the empty gurney while it seemed to stare back at her. The white sheet moved slightly, as if stirred by a breeze that existed only in some parallel dimension. Then, without warning, the gurney resumed its journey, rejoining its companions as they disappeared around the corner towards storage room C. Elena remained motionless for another 5 minutes, listening to the building's familiar symphony of mechanical sounds and settling noises. When she finally worked up the courage to investigate, she found all 3 gurneys in their proper locations, secured exactly as she had left them hours earlier. But in the supply closet where she had been working, she found the 4th rule written in condensation on the mirror. Rule 4. When the gurneys take themselves for a walk, Do not interfere with their journey. They are fulfilling an appointment you cannot understand. Thomas explained later that the moving gurneys were one of the morgue's most consistent phenomena, occurring roughly twice a month with no discernible pattern. Previous night shift workers had tried various approaches, following the gurneys, blocking their path, even attempting to ride one during its mysterious journey. None of these experiments had ended well. Jackson Winters tried to follow them, Thomas said during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about the morgue's supernatural protocols. This was maybe 5 years ago. Found him the next morning curled up in storage room C, completely catatonic. Couldn't speak for 3 weeks, and when he finally did, all he could say was that he had seen where they were going and it wasn't a place for the living. Elena learned that Jackson now worked as a crossing guard at the elementary school, a job that kept him in sunlight and surrounded by the laughter of children. He had never spoken publicly about his experience at the morgue, but Thomas said his hair had gone completely white overnight, and he still refused to enter any building after sunset. The psychological toll of working at the morgue was something Elena hadn't anticipated during her job interview. She had expected the normal stresses associated with handling deceased individuals, the emotional weight of death, the clinical detachment required for the work, the irregular sleep schedule. But she hadn't prepared for the constant state of hypervigilance required to navigate the building's supernatural landscape. Every sound required analysis. Was that footstep pattern normal settling, or someone walking? Was that temperature change due to the HVAC system, or something else entering the room? Was that shadow caused by the emergency lighting, or was it moving independently? Elena found herself mentally cataloging and categorizing every sensory input, developing an almost supernatural awareness of the building's rhythms and moods. The stress manifested in unexpected ways. Elena began experiencing vivid dreams about the morgue even when she was at home. Dreams where she wandered the familiar hallways but found rooms that didn't exist in the real building. These dream rooms were always wrong somehow. Too long, too dark, or filled with gurneys arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her appetite decreased, and she found herself losing weight despite the physical demands of the job being minimal. Food began to taste different, as if her encounters with the supernatural had somehow altered her perception of normal experiences. Coffee, which had once been a comfort, now seemed bitter and metallic, especially when consumed in the morgue's break room. Sleep became elusive, even during her days off. Elena would lie in bed, listening to every sound her apartment made, comparing them to the building's nightly symphony. She became hypersensitive to temperature changes, to shadows that moved slightly, to any deviation from absolute normalcy. The morgue was conditioning her to exist in a state of constant awareness that made peaceful rest nearly impossible. But perhaps most disturbing was how the job was changing her relationship with death itself. Elena had always viewed death as a natural, if sad, conclusion to life. Working with deceased individuals had been emotionally challenging, but not fundamentally disturbing. However, the morgue was teaching her that death might not be the clear-cut transition she had always believed it to be. The bodies stored in the morgue seemed less like empty vessels and more like sleeping individuals who might wake up if disturbed. Elena found herself speaking to them softly during her rounds, not because she believed they could hear her, but because the alternative, treating them as mere objects in a building full of supernatural activity, seemed somehow dangerous. Dr. Hayes noticed the changes during Elena's monthly evaluation. She had lost 12 pounds, developed dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't disguise, and had begun speaking in the careful, measured tones that characterized long-term morgue employees. It was a particular way of talking that Elena hadn't noticed until she caught herself doing it, speaking quietly, avoiding sudden vocal changes, as if loud sounds might wake something that was better left sleeping. The night shift is harder than most people realize, Dr. Hayes said during the evaluation, her tone carefully neutral. If you're having trouble adjusting, there are day positions available at the hospital. Good benefits, normal hours, regular human contact. But Elena had already invested too much of herself in understanding the morgue's mysteries to walk away. Each rule she learned felt like a piece of a larger puzzle. And despite the stress and fear, she found herself genuinely curious about what was happening in the building. The scientist in her wanted answers, wanted to understand the mechanics of whatever supernatural ecosystem had established itself within the morgue's walls. The fifth rule appeared during Elena's 10th week, after an incident that shook her confidence in her ability to handle whatever the morgue might throw at her. She had been working a particularly quiet night, completing inventory and updating records, when she realized she hadn't seen her own reflection in over an hour. The discovery came accidentally. Elena had been washing her hands in the prep room sink when she glanced up at the mirror mounted above it. The reflection showed the room behind her, the equipment, the overhead lights, everything except Elena herself. She waved her hand, moved her head from side to side, even stepped closer to the mirror. The room's reflection moved accordingly, but Elena remained invisible. Panic began to build in her chest, a cold certainty that something fundamental had gone wrong. She hurried to the bathroom, then to the break room, checking every reflective surface she could find. In each mirror, each piece of polished metal, each darkened window, the same thing happened. Everything appeared except Elena herself. The terror of not existing, even in reflection, was unlike anything she had experienced during her time at the morgue. The other phenomena had been frightening, but external, things happening around her that she could observe and navigate. This was different. This suggested that the morgue wasn't just haunted by outside entities, but that it was somehow affecting her own existence in ways she couldn't understand. Elena ran to the chapel, her sanctuary, and collapsed into one of the folding chairs. For 20 minutes, she sat in the small room, fighting panic and trying to rationalize what had happened. When she finally worked up the courage to check the chapel's small mirror, her reflection appeared normally, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But when she returned to her duties, she found the fifth rule written in her own handwriting on a piece of paper that hadn't been there before, sitting on the desk where she had been working. Rule 5. If you cannot see your reflection, go immediately to the chapel and do not leave until sunrise. You are becoming too much like them, and there may not be a way back. The implications of the fifth rule haunted Elena more than any of the supernatural encounters she had experienced. It suggested that working at the morgue wasn't just dangerous because of external entities, but because prolonged exposure to whatever existed there could fundamentally alter a person's existence. The rule implied that there were others who had become too much like them and had never found their way back to normal human existence. Thomas confirmed her worst fears when she asked him about it the following evening. "We've had people go missing over the years," he said quietly, his eyes focused on something beyond the break room walls. "Not quit, not transfer, not die in any way we could document. Just stop existing in any way that normal people could perceive. Their names disappear from records. Their families forget them. Their apartments become vacant, as if they never lived there." He paused, and Elena could see him struggling with whether to continue. But sometimes, late at night, when the building gets particularly active, you can still hear them, still see shadows that move like people, still feel presences that remember being human. The morgue doesn't just house the dead, it collects them. Elena's 11th week at the Clearwater County Morgue brought with it a cold snap that seemed to settle permanently within the building's walls. Even with the heating system running constantly, certain areas remained inexplicably frigid, as if winter had claimed them for its own domain. Storage rooms had become so cold that Elena's breath produced thick clouds whenever she approached it, and the door handle had developed a thin layer of frost that never melted despite the building's controlled climate. It was during this time that Elena began to notice she was being watched. The sensation started subtly, a prickle at the back of her neck during routine tasks, a peripheral awareness of eyes tracking her movement through the hallways. At first, she attributed it to the general unease that permeated the morgue after dark, but as the nights progressed, the feeling became more specific and more insistent. Someone, or something, was observing her with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. The realization came during her Thursday night shift, when Elena was updating intake records in the prep room. She had been working for several hours in relative peace, the building's supernatural inhabitants seemingly quiet for once. But as she reached for a file folder, she caught sight of the security monitor mounted in the corner of the room. The monitor displayed feeds from the 4 security cameras installed throughout the building. One in the main hallway, one in the prep room where Elena currently sat, one focused on the entrance, and one that supposedly watched Storage Room C, though that particular feed had shown nothing but static for as long as anyone could remember. But tonight, the Storage Room C feed was clear. Elena stared at the monitor in disbelief. The static had cleared completely, revealing the interior of Storage Room C in sharp detail. She could see the metal storage units lining the walls, the overhead fluorescent lights casting their harsh illumination, and the wheeled gurneys positioned throughout the room. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it should look, except for the people. There were dozens of them, standing perfectly still throughout the room like mannequins in a store display. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in the clothing they had presumably worn when they died. Some appear to be from recent decades, their modern clothing instantly recognizable. Others seemed much older, wearing styles from the 1960s, 1950s, even earlier periods. But what made Elena's blood turn to ice was the realization that every single one of them was staring directly at the security camera with the fixed intensity of individuals who knew they were being watched in return. Elena's hand shook as she grabbed the radio to call Thomas. But before she could key the microphone, every figure on the monitor turned in perfect unison to look at something off-camera. They maintained their eerie synchronization as they began walking slowly toward whatever had captured their attention, their movements deliberate and purposeful. The monitor flickered once, twice, then returned to its familiar static display. Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had witnessed. The logical part of her mind suggested equipment malfunction, perhaps some kind of feedback loop or electromagnetic interference, causing false images to appear on screen. But the sight had felt undeniably real, and the coordination of the figure's movements spoke to an intelligence and awareness that transcended simple visual artifacts. She spent the remainder of her shift avoiding Storage Room C entirely, but she could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking her movement throughout the building. Every time she passed the door to Storage Room C, the sensation intensified, as if dozens of individuals were pressed against the other side, listening for her footsteps and monitoring her proximity. When Thomas arrived the next evening, Elena immediately showed him the security monitor. The Storage Room C feed displayed its usual static, and Thomas's expression suggested he was familiar with the camera's malfunction. "Been broken for about 3 years now," he said casually, adjusting the monitor's angle. "County keeps promising to fix it, but the repair technicians have trouble with that particular camera. Something about electromagnetic interference. They get the thing working, and it fails again within a week." Elena described what she had seen, expecting Thomas to dismiss her account as stress-induced hallucination or equipment malfunction. Instead, his face grew pale, and he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "You saw them clearly?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Could you make out individual faces, clothing, details?" "Every one of them," Elena confirmed. "They were all different ages, different time periods based on their clothing. But they were all staring at the camera like they knew I was watching. And then they all turned at the same time to look at something else." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, staring at the static film monitor with the expression of someone calculating odds he didn't like. Finally, he spoke. In 20 years of working here, only 3 people have ever seen them clearly on the monitor. The others reported vague shapes, shadows, movement that could have been anything, but clear images with specific details. He trailed off, then looked directly at Elena. The last person who reported seeing them that clearly was Jackson Winters, the night before we found him at Storage Room C. The implications of Thomas's statement sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the building's supernatural cold spots. She was developing a connection to whatever existed within the morgue, a connection that was becoming dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. Over the following nights, Elena began to notice other changes in her perception of the morgue's supernatural ecosystem. Sounds that had once been ambiguous now carried clear meaning. The whispers in the walls were becoming more distinct, occasionally resolving into recognizable words and phrases. The footsteps in the hallway had developed individual characteristics. She could distinguish between the heavy boots of what seemed to be a man from the 1940s and the lighter steps of someone wearing modern sneakers. Most disturbing of all, Elena was beginning to see them during her peripheral vision. Quick glimpses of figures standing at the ends of hallways, shadows that moved independently of any light source, faces that appeared for split seconds in reflective surfaces before vanishing when she turned to look directly. The morgue's invisible population was becoming visible to her, and with that visibility came a terrible understanding of just how crowded the building really was. Dr. Hayes noticed Elena's deteriorating condition during an unscheduled visit to the morgue on a Friday evening. Elena had been so focused on cataloging the supernatural phenomena that she hadn't realized how dramatically her appearance had changed. She had lost additional weight. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and her eyes had developed the 1,000-yard stare that characterized individuals who had seen too much. "Elena, I need you to take some time off," Dr. Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not accept arguments. "You're showing signs of severe stress, and continuing to work in this environment isn't healthy." But Elena protested, surprising herself with the desperation in her voice. "I can't leave now. I'm finally beginning to understand what's happening here. The patterns, the connections, the rules, they're all part of something larger, something important." Dr. Hayes' expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Elena, listen to yourself. You're talking about supernatural patterns and connections like they're scientific data. This job is affecting your perception of reality in ways that concern me professionally and personally." The confrontation forced Elena to confront a truth she had been avoiding. She was becoming obsessed with the morgue's mysteries in a way that was unhealthy and potentially dangerous. But she couldn't bring herself to care about the risks. The supernatural ecosystem of the Clearwater County Morgue was the most fascinating and complex phenomenon she had ever encountered, and walking away felt like abandoning the discovery of a lifetime. That night, alone in the building after Dr. Hayes had left with promises to discuss options, in the morning, Elena made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. Instead of avoiding Storage Room C, as she had been doing since seeing the figures on the monitor, she walked directly to the door and placed her hand on the frosted handle. The metal was so cold it burned her palm, but Elena didn't let go. She could hear movement on the other side of the door, a soft shuffling like dozens of people shifting position in a confined space. The whispers that permeated the building's walls were strongest here, occasionally resolving into what sounded like conversations carried on in languages she didn't recognize and English phrases from different historical periods. Elena pressed her ear to the door and listened. The voices were discussing her. "She can see us now," said a woman's voice that carried the accent of the early 20th century. "The connection is almost complete." "Too fast," replied a man whose speech patterns suggested the 1970s. "She's not ready for the transition. Her anchor to the living world is still too strong. The choice may not be hers to make, whispered a third voice, this one so old and fragmented that Elena could barely make out the words. The building is hungry, and she has opened herself to feeding it. Elena jerked away from the door, her heart hammering with the realization that the entities in storage room C weren't just aware of her presence. They were actively discussing her fate. She was not simply a witness to the morgue's supernatural activity. She had become a participant in whatever process transformed the living into permanent residents of the building's otherworldly ecosystem. The security monitor in the prep room flickered to life as Elena passed it. The storage room C feed once again displaying a clear image. This time, the figures weren't staring at the camera. They were all looking directly at the door, as if they knew Elena had been listening to their conversation. And standing at the front of the group, wearing the uniform of a morgue attendant, was Jackson Winters. His hair was no longer white, but had returned to its original brown color, and his face held the same peaceful expression worn by all the other figures in the room. He raised his hand in what could have been a greeting or a warning, then pointed directly at the camera and mouthed the single word that Elena could read clearly on his lips. Run. The monitor returned to static, leaving Elena alone with the terrible knowledge that Jackson Winters hadn't simply had a breakdown and left town. He had become one of them, trapped in storage room C with a growing collection of individuals who had worked too long in the morgue and lost their connection to the living world. And Elena was following the same path. Elena's 12th week at the Clearwater County Morgue began with a discovery that shattered any remaining illusions about the building's true nature. She arrived for her shift to find that someone had left a personnel file on her desk. Her own personnel file, but one that contained records she had never seen before. According to the documents, Elena Rodriguez was the 17th night shift attendant hired in the past 5 years. The previous 16 were listed with their hire dates, their last recorded shift, and a final notation that simply read, "Position terminated. Employee unavailable." No forwarding addresses, no final paychecks, no exit interviews. Just sudden absence followed by administrative silence. But most disturbing were the photographs. Each employee's ID photo showed the same progression Elena had been experiencing. The gradual weight loss, the pale complexion, the hollow eyes of someone being slowly drained of their essential humanity. The final photo in each file, labeled as a security update, showed individuals who looked more like ghosts than living people. Their features so translucent they seemed to be fading from the physical world entirely. Elena spread the files across her desk with trembling hands, studying the faces of her predecessors. She recognized some of them now. The whispered voices in the walls, the shadow figures in her peripheral vision, the watchers in storage room C. They weren't supernatural entities haunting the morgue. They were former employees who had been consumed by whatever force operated within the building's walls. The realization brought with it a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. Elena finally understood the true purpose of the 5 rules, the real reason behind the morgue's difficulty retaining staff, and the inevitable fate that awaited anyone who worked the night shift long enough to form a connection with the building's otherworldly ecosystem. She was dying, slowly but inexorably, becoming something that existed between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The morgue wasn't just haunted. It was hungry, feeding on the life force of those who spent enough time within its walls to become susceptible to its influence. Each night shift was another step toward complete absorption into its supernatural ecosystem. Elena looked at her reflection in the break room mirror and saw Jackson Winters looking back at her. Not literally, but the same hollow expression, the same translucent quality to the skin, the same eyes that had seen too much of what existed beyond normal human perception. She was becoming one of them, and according to the files, she had perhaps a week before the transformation became irreversible. The question was, what could she do about it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Miranda Hayes arrived at the morgue that evening earlier than usual, carrying a briefcase that she set down on Elena's desk with the weight of someone who had made a difficult decision. "I know you're not going to quit," Dr. Hayes said without preamble, "and I know you're not going to listen to warnings about your health or your safety. So instead, I'm going to tell you something that might help you survive what you're going through." She opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with a county seal and a classification Elena had never seen before: historical documentation, restricted access. The Clearwater County Morgue isn't just built on former burial ground, Dr. Hayes began, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. It's built on a site that has been used for death-related purposes for over 200 years. Native American burial ground, Civil War mass grave, tuberculosis hospital, and now a morgue. The land has absorbed so much death energy that it's become what paranormal researchers call a threshold site, a place where the boundary between dimensions becomes permeable. Elena listened in stunned silence as Dr. Hayes explained the morgue's true history. The building had been constructed not despite the land's supernatural properties, but because of them. County officials in the 1950s had decided that if the site was going to be permanently haunted anyway, they might as well use it for a purpose that could benefit from supernatural activity. Bodies stored here don't decompose at the normal rate, Dr. Hayes continued, showing Elena photographs and documentation that had been collected over decades. The supernatural energy that permeates the building slows the natural processes of decay, making our job easier from a practical standpoint. But there's a cost. The cost, Elena learned, was the slow absorption of any living person who spent extended time within the building's influence. The threshold effect worked both ways. While it slowed the transition from life to death for corpses stored in the morgue, it accelerated the transition from life to something else for living individuals who remained in the building long enough. The 5 rules aren't arbitrary superstitions, Dr. Hayes explained, pulling out a leather-bound journal that looked decades old. They're survival protocols developed through trial and error by previous night shift workers who managed to recognize what was happening to them before it was too late. Elena opened a journal and found pages upon pages of handwritten accounts, observations, and warnings left by her predecessors. The writing styles changed from entry to entry, but the message remained consistent. The morgue was alive in a way that defied scientific explanation, and it was slowly claiming everyone who worked within its walls. Rule 1 prevents you from acknowledging the spirits directly, which would strengthen your connection to their realm, Dr. Hayes continued. Rule 2 gets you to sacred ground before the building's energy peaks. Rule 3 keeps you from entering storage room C when it's most active. Rule 4 prevents you from interfering with the supernatural processes that maintain the building's equilibrium. And Rule 5. She paused, meeting Elena's eyes directly. Rule 5 is the last warning before complete transformation. Elena flipped through the journal, reading accounts from workers who had experienced the same phenomena she had been encountering. The progression was always the same. Initial supernatural encounters, gradual physical changes, increasing psychic sensitivity, and finally, complete absorption into the morgue's otherworldly ecosystem. But some entries were different. 3 workers over the past 30 years had managed to break free from the building's influence before reaching the point of no return. Their accounts describe a process that was both physically and emotionally excruciating, but which had allowed them to reclaim their humanity and escape the morgue's supernatural pull. The key is understanding that the building feeds on willing participation, Dr. Hayes explained. Every time you follow the rules, every time you adapt to the supernatural phenomena instead of fighting it, you're giving your consent to be consumed. The process requires cooperation, even if that cooperation is unconscious. Elena felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. If the transformation required her consent, then theoretically, she could withdraw that consent and break free from whatever was happening to her. But the journal entries made it clear that the process was not simple or guaranteed. The building will fight back, Dr. Hayes warned. It's invested weeks in preparing you for absorption, and it won't give up easily. The supernatural activity will intensify, the physical effects will worsen, and you'll experience psychological pressure designed to make you surrender to the process voluntarily. That night, Elena began her attempt to reclaim her humanity. Instead of following the established rules that had kept her safe, but complicit in her own consumption, she deliberately violated them in carefully planned ways designed to assert her independence from the building's influence. She acknowledged the footsteps in the hallway after midnight, speaking directly to whatever invisible presence walked the corridors. "I know you're there," she said aloud, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "And I know what you want, but I'm not giving it to you." The response was immediate and violent. Every light in the building began flickering rapidly, not in the rhythmic pattern that would have sent her to the chapel, but in chaotic bursts that seemed designed to trigger seizures. The temperature throughout the building plummeted so rapidly that ice began forming on the windows, and Elena's breath became visible in thick clouds that hung in the air like fog. But instead of fleeing to the chapel as the rules dictated, Elena stood her ground in the main hallway and waited. The supernatural tantrum continued for nearly an hour, with equipment malfunctioning, alarms sounding randomly, and the building's ventilation system producing sounds like screaming wind. Through it all, Elena remained motionless, refusing to show fear or compliance. Eventually, the phenomena subsided, leaving Elena exhausted but victorious. She had challenged the building's authority and survived, proving to herself that she was not completely powerless in the relationship. The next phase of her rebellion involved Storage Room C. When Elena heard singing emanating from behind the door, instead of walking away as Rule 3 demanded, she opened the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she remembered from her initial orientation, filled with metal storage units and wheeled gurneys arranged in neat rows. But now Elena could see the room's other occupants clearly. Dozens of figures standing silently among the equipment, all of them former morgue employees who had been absorbed into the building's supernatural ecosystem. They looked at her with expressions of profound sadness, their translucent faces showing the grief of individuals who had lost their connection to the living world. Jackson Winters stepped forward from the group, his mouth moving in words Elena could barely hear. "You don't have to stay," he whispered, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone speaking from a great distance. "We chose this. We gave up fighting, but you can still leave." The other figures nodded in agreement, and Elena realized that they weren't trying to trap her in the morgue. They were trying to save her from their fate. The supernatural phenomena, the frightening encounters, even the 5 rules were all attempts by previous victims to warn future employees about what was happening to them. "Al," Elena asked aloud, "how do I break free completely?" Jackson pointed toward the chapel, but his gesture seemed to encompass something beyond the small room itself. "Sacred ground," he said, "but not just any sacred ground. You need to find the source, the original consecration that still has power over this place." Elena spent the remainder of her shift in the chapel, not hiding from supernatural activity, but researching the building's history using Dr. Hayes's restricted files. She learned that before the tuberculosis hospital, before the Civil War graves, before even the Native American burial ground, the site had been home to a small Methodist church built by early settlers in the 1820s. The church had been destroyed by a tornado in 1847, but according to the historical records, its cemetery had never been properly relocated. The morgue had been built directly over the church's foundation, and somewhere beneath the building lay the original altar stone that had been consecrated nearly 2 centuries earlier. Elena realized that the chapel in the morgue was positioned directly above where the original church altar would have stood. The small room wasn't just a modern addition for employee comfort. It was built on the one spot in the building that retained enough sacred energy to counteract the supernatural forces that had claimed the rest of the site. But using the chapel passively, as a refuge, wasn't enough to break free from the building's influence. Elena needed to actively reclaim the sacred space and reassert its power over the corrupted land. She needed to perform her own consecration ceremony, one that would purify not just herself, but the entire building. The idea was dangerous. Attempting to spiritually cleanse a location with as much accumulated supernatural energy as the Clearwater County Morgue could either free everyone trapped within its influence or destroy Elena completely. But looking at the translucent faces of her predecessors in Storage Room C, Elena realized that the risk was worth taking. She had 1 week before her transformation became irreversible. 1 week to gather the materials and knowledge necessary to attempt something that had never been tried before. The spiritual reclamation of a threshold site that had been feeding on human souls for over 70 years. The building seemed to sense her intentions. As Elena prepared to leave at the end of her shift, every supernatural phenomenon she had experienced during her time at the morgue manifested simultaneously. Footsteps echoed through the hallways. Lights flickered in chaotic patterns. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the whispers in the walls became a cacophony of voices pleading, threatening, and bargaining for her compliance. But Elena walked through it all without flinching, her resolve strengthened by the knowledge that her predecessors were counting on her to succeed where they had failed. She was no longer just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the souls of everyone who had ever been consumed by the Clearwater County Morgue. Elena's final week at the Clearwater County Morgue was unlike any experience she had encountered during her 3 months of employment. The building itself seemed to have awakened to the threat she represented, and every night brought escalating supernatural phenomena designed to break her resolve before she could complete her planned consecration ritual. The research had taken Elena 4 days to complete, working with Dr. Hayes to uncover the specific details of the original Methodist Church and the proper procedures for reclaiming consecrated ground. They discovered that the church had been built by Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, a circuit preacher who had been known for his ability to cleanse places where evil had taken root. His personal journal, preserved in the County Historical Society, contained detailed instructions for consecration rituals specifically designed to purify locations that had been corrupted by supernatural forces. But the building fought back against their research. Documents would disappear from Elena's desk, only to reappear days later in locations where they couldn't possibly have been placed by human hands. Computer files became corrupted with inexplicable frequency, forcing Elena and Dr. Hayes to work primarily with physical documents and handwritten notes. The morgue's landline produced increasingly aggressive interference whenever they tried to contact outside experts or religious authorities. Most disturbing of all, the entities in Storage Room C had begun appearing throughout the building during Elena's shifts. She would turn a corner to find Jackson Winters standing in the hallway, his translucent form flickering like a faulty light bulb. Other former employees would materialize in her peripheral vision, always at the edge of her awareness, silently watching her preparations with expressions that mixed hope and desperation. The building was mobilizing every resource at its disposal to prevent Elena from completing the ritual, but their presence also served as a reminder of what was at stake. Each ghostly figure represented not just a life that had been consumed, but a soul that could potentially be freed if Elena's plan succeeded. The consecration ritual itself was deceptively simple, requiring only 3 elements: salt blessed by a practicing minister, water from a natural spring that predated the area's supernatural corruption, and a relic from the original church to serve as a focal point for the ceremony. Dr. Hayes had contacted Reverend Patricia Hawthorne, the current pastor of Clearwater's Methodist Church, who agreed to bless the salt despite her skepticism about the morgue's supernatural problems. The spring water came from a source Elena discovered in the county historical records. A natural spring located 2 miles from the morgue that had been used by Reverend Morrison for baptisms in the 1820s. The spring still existed, hidden in a grove of ancient oak trees that seemed untouched by the supernatural corruption that had claimed the surrounding land. But finding a relic from the original church proved more challenging. The tornado that destroyed the building in 1847 had scattered debris across several square miles, and subsequent development had buried most of the remains. Elena spent her days off searching through the county museum storage facilities, hoping to find something, anything, that had survived from Reverend Morrison's congregation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an elderly woman who had worked as the county clerk for over 40 years, approached Elena after hearing about her research from Dr. Hayes. Mrs. Kellerman's great-great-grandmother had been a member of Reverend Morrison's congregation, and the family had preserved a small wooden cross that had supposedly been carved from a beam of the original church altar. "I always thought it was just a family legend," Mrs. Kellerman said as she handed Elena the cross. "But if there's any truth to the stories about that place, maybe this can help put some souls to rest." The cross was small and simple, worn smooth by nearly 2 centuries of handling. But Elena could feel a subtle warmth emanating from the wood that suggested it retained some connection to its sacred origins. With all 3 elements assembled, she was ready to attempt the consecration ritual on her final night shift. Elena arrived at the morgue that Friday evening to find the building in a state of supernatural chaos unlike anything she had previously experienced. Every light in the facility was flickering at different frequencies, creating a strobe effect that made navigation dangerous. The temperature fluctuated so rapidly that condensation formed and evaporated on the walls in continuous cycles, and the building's structural elements creaked and groaned as if the facility was trying to tear itself apart. But most unnervingly, Elena could see every spirit that inhabited the morgue clearly for the first time. Dozens of translucent figures filled the hallways, former employees from different decades standing silently in the corridors like an ethereal receiving line. Their faces showed a mixture of hope and terror, as if they understood that Elena's ritual would either free them or destroy them completely. Thomas had chosen not to work that evening, claiming a sudden illness that Elena suspected was actually supernatural intuition warning him to stay away. She was grateful for his absence. The ritual would be dangerous enough without worrying about the safety of others. Elena made her way to the chapel, carrying the blessed salt, spring water, and wooden cross in a bag that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The building's supernatural defenses intensified as she approached the sacred space, with invisible forces pushing against her like a powerful wind and voices whispering threats and promises in languages she couldn't identify. The chapel itself was the only calm space in the entire facility, a pocket of peace surrounded by chaos. Elena knelt before the simple wooden cross mounted on the wall and began the ritual, as described in Reverend Morrison's journal. She sprinkled the blessed salt in a circle around the room's perimeter, reciting the Latin phrases she had memorized from the historical documents. The salt hissed and sparked where it touched the floor, as if it was burning away invisible corruption that had accumulated over decades. Next, Elena used the spring water to trace the sign of the cross on each wall, speaking the words of consecration that Reverend Morrison had used to claim the original church ground for sacred purposes. The water glowed with a soft, warm light as it touched the walls, and Elena could feel the room's atmosphere beginning to change. Finally, she placed the wooden cross from Mrs. Kellerman's family in the center of the salt circle and knelt beside it, placing her hands on the worn wood and speaking the final words of the ritual. "By the power of sacred ground and holy purpose, I reclaim this place from the forces that would corrupt it. Let all souls trapped here be freed to find their proper rest, and let this location be purified of the darkness that has claimed it." The response was immediate and violent. Every window in the building shattered simultaneously, filling the air with the sound of breaking glass and howling wind. The lights throughout the facility exploded in showers of sparks, plunging the morgue into complete darkness, except for the soft glow emanating from the wooden cross. Elena felt the building fighting against the consecration with every ounce of supernatural energy it had accumulated over decades of feeding on human souls. The floor beneath her feet bucked and heaved like an earthquake, and invisible forces pulled at her clothing and hair, trying to drag her away from the protective circle of salt. But the ritual held. The wooden cross grew brighter and warmer, its light pushing back against the darkness that had claimed the building for so long. Elena could hear voices crying out in relief and gratitude as the spirits trapped in storage room C were finally released from their supernatural prison. The cleansing process took 3 hours. Elena remained kneeling in the salt circle while waves of supernatural energy washed over the building, purging decades of accumulated corruption and freeing the souls that had been consumed by the morgue's otherworldly ecosystem. She watched as translucent figures walked past the chapel doorway, no longer trapped, but finally able to move on to whatever came after death. Jackson Winters was among the last to leave. He paused in the chapel doorway and looked back at Elena with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice clearer than she had ever heard it. "We've been waiting so long for someone strong enough to set us free." Then he was gone, along with all the other spirits that had haunted the Clearwater County morgue for decades. When dawn broke over the Missouri hills, Elena emerged from the chapel to find a building that felt fundamentally different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, the cold spots had normalized, and the whispers in the walls had been replaced by the simple, natural sounds of an old building settling in the morning light. Dr. Hayes arrived an hour later to find Elena sitting peacefully in the break room, looking healthier than she had in weeks. The translucent quality had faded from Elena's skin, and the hollow expression had been replaced by the satisfied look of someone who had completed an important task. "It's over," Elena said simply. "They're free, and the building is just a building again." The Clearwater County morgue continued to operate normally after Elena's consecration ritual, but it never again had trouble retaining night shift staff. The supernatural phenomena that had plagued the facility for decades disappeared completely, and employees reported that working there felt no different from any other medical facility. Elena left her position the following week, not because she was afraid or because the job had become unbearable, but because her work there was finished. She had broken a cycle of supernatural predation that had claimed 17 previous employees and freed dozens of trapped souls to find their proper rest. She never spoke publicly about her experiences at the morgue, but word spread through the small communities of the Missouri Ozarks about what had happened at the Clearwater County facility. Other locations with similar supernatural problems began reaching out to Elena, asking for help at their own threshold sites and corrupted sacred ground. Elena Rodriguez had discovered her true calling not as a morgue attendant, but as someone who could reclaim places where the boundary between worlds had been compromised. She spent her remaining years traveling throughout the Ozark region, performing consecration rituals at locations where death and supernatural forces had created environments that trapped souls between dimensions. The wooden cross from Mrs. Kellerman's family became Elena's most treasured tool, its connection to Reverend Morrison's original consecration, making it uniquely effective at purifying corrupted sacred ground. Each ritual she performed added to the cross's power, creating a spiritual artifact that could cleanse even the most heavily infested supernatural locations. But Elena never forgot the lesson she learned during her time at the Clearwater County morgue. The boundary between life and death is not as solid as most people believe, and there are places in this world where that boundary has become dangerously thin. In such locations, the living must remain vigilant, Because the forces that exist between dimensions are always hungry, always waiting, and always looking for souls willing to feed their eternal appetite. The 5 rules that once governed survival at the haunted morgue were eventually forgotten, no longer necessary in a building that had been cleansed of its supernatural corruption. But Elena kept copies of them as a reminder of how quickly a person can lose their humanity when confronted with forces that exist beyond normal understanding. And sometimes, late at night, in other threshold locations she was called to cleanse, Elena would hear whispers in the walls that sounded familiar, not the voices of trapped souls, but the grateful acknowledgments of spirits she had helped to find peace. In those moments, she knew that her work at the Clearwater County Morgue had been more than just a job. It had been a calling to help souls lost between worlds find their way home.